Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. We shall continue our study of the early modern period in British literature, which is approximately divided into this time frame in our textbook. And if you recall from a previous conversation, these two centuries, the 1500s and the 1600s, can be roughly divided between major figures who kind of governed the fate of this country. And here it was the Henry VIII and then Elizabeth the First. Were dominant political figures, and the destiny of the country depended on what the monarchs thought, so to speak. And also at this time, another key factor was the Protestant Reformation, as you recall, which occurred at the beginning of the century. So Reformation was very important. So 1500 then marks a very important landmark, approximately in our studies. In 1600. Now, 1603 is when Elizabeth dies, and King James the First takes rule, and there are some turbulent times over here with Charles the First taking rule and his struggles with the Parliament, and briefly there's being parliamentary rule with Cromwell over here, and the restoration of the monarchy with Charles II, and but the monarchy would, as you recall, would never be the same. As also suggested previously, this 1600 saw a rise of the scientific discoveries. Descartes, in the beginning of the part of the century, is when he thrived, and Newton dominated the second half of the 1600s. That's very important, kind of gives you a landmark for what was happening here. And Elizabeth I is when Shakespeare wrote his greatest plays of his times. Now, this is important because all of this happened because of the events that occurred immediately in the preceding century with the Gutenberg invention, the printing press, and discovery of the New World, and the riches there. And we must also understand that in this time over here, with the beginning with the Charles Rhine, that American colonies were established. 1607 being Jamestown, if you recall, and Plymouth was 1620. Nevertheless, the colonies were very important because they subsequently provided great wealth to the British Crown, and that was very important. Now, that's another transformative force, if you Reformation being one, and what was happening with the rules of England, and the scientific revolution being another one, and the formation of colonies being important. These are important forces. The key force was development of a new class of individuals, and this was the middle class. As societies became complex, and as trade increased with the colonies and also with the Islamic world, as trade increased with the colonies, the English became rich, and a new class of individuals developed. And this was the middle class. The middle class has obviously not as much money as the upper class, but they were greater in number. So there was this demand in books for entertainment purposes, but also for literacy, because the complexity of the business world demanded that they knew more than rudimentary literacy. So increase in literacy was a supply-demand type of a thing. The existence of the middle class necessitated a certain degree of literacy. You couldn't be a businessman, a merchant, or any tradesman with some element of literacy and command of the language. So there was a rise in literacy. Another thing that happened because of this rise of the middle class in literacy and an increase in demand in books is that the type of authors change. Writers. who wrote the books before. Previously, books were written by monks in monasteries and etc. This is stereotypical look, of course, but previously that was the majority. The output of books were written by elements of the church. But now the writers and authors were coming from the middle class. As you can also then understand that the character of writing therefore changed. So type of writers changed, and therefore the character of writing changed. Okay, the output changed. This is important. For example, so some of the characters we suggested before. John Donne's father was an ironmonger. Worked with iron, and Christopher Marlowe's father was a shoemaker, and Ben Jonson's father was a bricklayer, and Robert Herrick's apparently his dad was a goldsmith, and Shakespeare himself was a merchant. So he was immediately from this very class, and because of this, the type of the character of writing, the storytelling, it also changed. Okay, and another fascinating thing happened is that because of the increased demand of literature, they were now able to this demand was sufficiently that there were professional writers, people who made their living writing books. And sometimes, as you can see with Shakespeare, sometimes their plays would be very sensational, so that they could make money. So this is very important to understand how the development of the middle class and increased literacy changed the course of literature, and changing the type of writers that such climate produced, and the character of writing. And in other words, specifically, they were professional writers, and they wrote primarily in plays in current modern English. Now, if you also recall, England in 1066 was conquered by William the Conqueror of William of Normandy, and French dominated the language landscape, so to speak. But Old English was there in the background. There were various dialects of English that existed in different parts of several miles apart. They would be different, as we recall. But there was a resurgence of English, and then eventually it would dominate. One of the reasons for this is that London, where became the capital, or where publishing capital of the area, as you can imagine. So publishing capital of the area. Now, since books would be, quote, mass printed, right? And this naturally led to a standardization, so to speak, standardization of language. Now, these are my terms, standardization of language. So, but anyway, if you had one focus of a hub, so to speak, of publishing, and you can imagine the great output of books coming from that area, whatever language that area happened to have, that language would become basically the language of wherever the books from that place were distributed to. So in England, English in London, English was spoken, and it came back with the resurgence, and English therefore very shortly it became the dominant language after French had been the official language for a long time. So nevertheless, the William the Conqueror eventually did not live at least a language imprint as much as might have been expected. Okay, so one more thing before we leave London and publishing industry is the reason English became a dominant language was apparently also because of something called the Great Vowel Shift. that occur, which resulted in development of modern English. The pronunciation changed dramatically. Okay, and the printing press, as I suggested, resulted in the standardization of language, or standardization of particular vernacular, particular variety of spoken and written English. Another aspect, we said the type of writers produced were different from this era, and the character of writing produced was different. Previously, like in the Middle Ages, what would be written would be dramatization of biblical stories. Here, as in Shakespearean plays, would be people most familiar with. Plays were of various different varieties, including tragedies, comedies, right, and pastoral plays, and historical plays, etc. So and topics would be of various different things. In those days, plays were kind of like movies of today. Common people would go watch them. Of course, even the nobility would watch them as well. But people would go watch these plays, and there was a source of entertainment for them. Now, it is not to be said that the religion did not play a role in what was going on literally. In fact, the religion played a very central role in what was happening. There were wars between Catholic and Protestant communities. People were beheaded, people were burned, people were killed, and because of their strong religious convictions. So it doesn't mean that the religion had no play. In fact, it was the background background noise, so to speak, for all discourses that were occurring. But nevertheless, the scope of writing output changed dramatically. Another thing that happened with the Renaissance, if you recall, Renaissance started with Italy, which means rebirth of knowledge, and this rediscovery of science was a greater interest in Greek and Roman literature, and this resulted in a new exploration of such literature. And of course, Shakespeare wrote a play called Julius Caesar as well. And secondly, so religion is not like laws. In fact, is a very common theme. Sir Walter Raleigh was a great defender of Elizabeth, and many authors wrote either to defend Protestantism, etc. But nevertheless, in this time, especially with scientific discoveries and science taking its own path, humanism or democratic ideals start to take root. And the absolute authority of kings, especially after the Civil War, was no longer taken for granted. This great chain of being, which means that from which kings got their authority. In other words, previously kings used to say that they had authority over people that was given to them from God, from a chain that linked them to their parents, to grandparents, to their great-grandparents, all the way up that way to, and the authority was given to them from God. But that was no longer taken for granted. And especially and democratic ideals started to side by side started to grow in the English realm. Okay, and so this is the background of this era, and specifically we're talking about the early modern period between 1500 to 1700. And this era are dominated by dramatic growth of England and great output, development of a middle class, increase in literacy, changing the type of writers and the type of writing produced. This is the time of Shakespeare, Milton, and John Donne, etc., whom we should study in some detail in the future. Until next time, as-salatu was-salamu ala rasulillah, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen, assalamu alaikum.